When a superpower captures a foreign president in the dead of night, they don't call it kidnapping, they call it liberation. But here's what nobody wants you to understand about what happened in Caracas at 2 a.m. on January 3rd. This wasn't about drugs, democracy, or Venezuelan freedom. This was the desperate final move of an empire that just discovered it can't survive without the oil beneath someone else's soil. For months, mainstream media has been selling you the same sanitized story. Trump is fighting the good fight against drug cartels. The U.S. military is protecting American communities from narcotics flooding across our borders. Nicolas Maduro is a dictator who deserves to be removed for the sake of Venezuelan democracy. It's a clean narrative that makes everyone feel good about supporting military intervention in Latin America once again. But that narrative just collapsed in spectacular fashion, because when you deploy 15,000 troops, position the world's most advanced aircraft carrier in the Caribbean, and coordinate a joint CIA Delta Force operation to snatch a sitting president, you're not fighting a drug war. You're fighting for control of something much more valuable than cocaine. The real story begins not with drugs, but with debt. The United States government needs to borrow $3 trillion this year just to keep the lights on. But here's the critical detail that changes everything. Their traditional buyers are walking away. Japan is selling U.S. bonds to save their currency. Europe is broke and dealing with their own crises. China is actively reducing their dollar holdings. So, where does America turn when the world stops lending? They turn to collateral, real physical assets that can back their increasingly worthless paper. And Venezuela happens to be sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Reserves that, under international law, could serve as collateral for hundreds of billions in emergency lending if the right government controls them. But here's where it gets truly fascinating and terrifying. The operation to capture Maduro wasn't planned last week or last month. This has been in the works since September, when the U.S. began systematically destroying alleged drug boats in the Caribbean. Over 30 strikes, more than 100 people killed, and not a single ounce of drugs has been displayed as evidence, because those weren't drug interdiction operations. They were rehearsals. Now, think about the timing of Saturday's operation. Trump announces it himself at 4:30 a.m., just hours after the strikes began. That's unprecedented. Presidents don't typically announce covert operations in real time unless they want the whole world to see their power, unless they want to send a message to every other oil-producing nation that cooperation is preferable to capture. The mainstream narrative wants you to focus on Maduro's crimes, his authoritarianism, his alleged drug trafficking, but they don't want you asking the obvious question: why now? Why, after 25 years of the same accusations, did this suddenly become urgent enough to risk a major military operation? The answer lies in something called the petrodollar system, and it's dying faster than anyone anticipated. For 50 years, the U.S. has maintained global dominance through a simple deal. Countries must use dollars to buy oil, which means every nation needs dollar reserves, which means everyone has to lend money to America to get those dollars. It's the most elegant pyramid scheme in history, and Venezuela just proved it can be broken. Since 2019, Venezuela has been selling oil to China in yuan, to India in rupees, and increasingly through cryptocurrency networks that bypass the U.S. banking system entirely. They've demonstrated that you can be completely cut off from the dollar system and still function as an oil exporting nation. That's not just inconvenient for Washington, it's existential. But here's what makes this operation truly explosive. The capture of Maduro isn't the end game. It's the beginning of something much larger. Because if the U.S. can simply remove any leader who refuses to price their oil in dollars, then the entire global South just received a very clear message about the price of financial independence. However, there's a critical detail that suggests this operation might backfire spectacularly. Maduro and his wife were reportedly flown out of the country, but nobody knows where. Not Venezuela's vice president, not regional allies. The complete blackout on their location isn't operational security, it's evidence that something went wrong. Because if this was a clean operation, Maduro would be in Miami right now giving interviews about his conversion to democracy. Instead, we have total silence, Venezuelan defense forces declaring a state of emergency, and calls for proof of life from Caracas. That's not the behavior of a defeated government. That's the behavior of a government that believes their leader was illegally kidnapped. And here's where the historical parallel becomes chilling. January 3rd, 2026 is exactly 36 years to the day after the U.S. captured Manuel Noriega in Panama. Same date, same method, same justification about drugs. But Panama in 1989 was a small nation with minimal international protection. Venezuela in 2026 has Russian air defense systems, Iranian missile technology, and Chinese financial backing. The silence from Moscow and Beijing since the operation isn't indifference, it's calculation. They're watching to see how far the U.S. is willing to escalate before they respond, because both nations have invested heavily in Venezuelan infrastructure and both have strategic reasons to prevent American control over the world's largest oil reserves. If you're finding this analysis eye-opening, if it's helping you see past the official narrative to understand what's really happening in global power dynamics, now would be a great time to subscribe. Your support helps us continue bringing you the kind of deep analysis that mainstream media simply won't touch. Because the story of Venezuela is really the story of how empire works in the 21st century. But let's examine what comes next, because that's where this story gets truly unpredictable. The U.S. now faces three possible scenarios, and none of them end well for American interests. Scenario one, they successfully install a puppet government in Venezuela, open the oil sector to American corporations, and use Venezuelan reserves as collateral for U.S. debt. This solves the immediate financial crisis, but confirms to every other resource-rich nation that independence equals invasion. The result is a massive acceleration of de-dollarization efforts worldwide. Scenario 2, Venezuelan resistance, backed by Russia and China, turns into a prolonged conflict. The U.S. finds itself fighting a proxy war 90 miles from Florida while trying to maintain operations in Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East. American military resources are stretched beyond capacity, and oil prices spike globally as markets price in supply disruption. Scenario 3, international pressure forces the U.S. to release Maduro and withdraw, handing China and Russia their biggest geopolitical victory since the end of the Cold War. American credibility collapses, and every oil producer from Saudi Arabia to Kazakhstan starts questioning whether dollar transactions are worth the political risk. Each scenario represents a form of imperial overstretch that historically precedes imperial collapse. The Romans faced similar choices in their final decades: expand aggressively and risk rebellion, or contract and risk irrelevance. But there's a fourth scenario that nobody in Washington wants to consider: that this operation was never really about Venezuela at all, that it was a demonstration of American capability designed to terrify other potential dollar defectors into compliance, a message to Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and Kazakhstan that financial independence comes with military consequences. If that's the case, then the location where Maduro and his wife were taken becomes critically important. Because if they're not in American custody, if they're in some third country or undisclosed location, then this wasn't a capture operation. It was a kidnapping designed to send a message. And kidnapping heads of state typically violates every international law and treaty the U.S. claims to defend. The technical details of the operation reveal just how desperate the situation has become for American planners. According to reports, explosions were heard across multiple Venezuelan states simultaneously, suggesting a coordinated strike involving dozens of targets. That's not a precision operation against drug infrastructure. That's systematic degradation of government military capacity. The fact that Venezuela's largest military complex was hit, that power was cut to multiple areas of Caracas, that aircraft were heard throughout the night, this was regime decapitation strategy. The goal wasn't to arrest Maduro, it was to cripple Venezuela's ability to resist whatever comes next. And here's the detail that should terrify every smaller nation. The Federal Aviation Administration immediately banned all U.S. civilian aircraft from Venezuelan airspace due to